The phone rang just after midnight. At first, I thought it was my alarm, but then I saw the number, the care home. My chest tightened before I even answered. My father had been there for months, and every late-night call felt like it carried a shadow. "Miss Taylor?" "I'm so sorry to wake you," the nurse whispered softly. "There's been a complication with your father's medication. We had to run an emergency order. The bill will need to be settled tomorrow." I nodded, though she couldn't see me, and promised I'd handle it. My savings were already paper thin, but my father's care always came first. It had to. The rain was relentless as I drove there, streetlights melting into gold and gray on the windshield. I signed the forms with a hand that shook from exhaustion, not cold. My card swiped. Another dent in my balance. Another breath of relief that he'd be okay. When I finally got home, dripping and drained, I noticed an envelope on the kitchen table. Heavy paper, law firm logo, my name in clean black ink. I ripped it open. Inside was a revised estate plan. My father's entire property, savings, and investments, transferred to my stepbrother. For a moment, I didn't breathe. Couldn't. This had to be a mistake, a misprint, something. But as I flipped through the pages, I saw my father's signature at the bottom of every sheet. Neat, intentional, permanent. I sat on the kitchen floor, the cold tile pressing against my legs, and stared at the wall like maybe it would explain everything I couldn't understand. I'd been paying his bills, sitting through sleepless nights, answering frantic calls. My stepbrother hadn't visited once. And yet, somehow, he got everything. Why? Why didn't my father tell me? Why did he choose him? The walls were silent. I thought of calling my father right then, but stopped. Not yet. Not like this. I needed to understand what I was walking into. Somewhere deep in my gut, I knew this wasn't just a choice. There was more to this. Something buried beneath signatures and smiles. I slid the envelope back into its cover, my fingers trembling as if I were holding a loaded secret. And I made myself a promise. I'd find out the truth, no matter how much it cost me, because this wasn't just about money. It was about trust. It was about love. And maybe betrayal. But I had no idea, standing there in my silent kitchen, that this was only the beginning, that the next thing I discover would change everything I thought I knew about my family. I didn't sleep that night. The envelope sat on my kitchen table like a silent predator, daring me to open it again, to reread every word I'd already memorized. I couldn't stop touching the pages, my fingertips tracing each signature, like maybe they would smudge and vanish if I pressed hard enough. But they didn't. By sunrise, I was exhausted and hollow, my coffee cold in my hands. Finally, I called the law firm printed on the letterhead. A calm voice answered, polite but detached, like I was just another line item on their morning schedule. "Hi, I received a package regarding my father's estate," I began, trying to keep my voice steady. "There must be a mistake." "No, Miss Taylor," the woman interrupted, almost too quickly. "The documents are accurate. Your father executed a full transfer of all primary assets to his son, Mr. Daniel Ellis, 2 weeks ago. It's legally binding, Daniel, my stepbrother." I hung up before my voice cracked. 2 weeks ago. I was literally sitting by my father's hospital bed 2 weeks ago, holding his hand as he drifted in and out of sleep. How could he have signed anything? He'd barely remembered my name that week. I couldn't stop the questions spiraling in my head. Did someone pressure him? Did he even know what he was signing? And why didn't he tell me? I grabbed my keys and drove straight to the care home, my heart beat louder than the engine. When I stepped into his room, my father looked smaller somehow, curled into the thin hospital blanket. His eyes fluttered open when I spoke. "Dad?" I whispered, holding up the envelope. "What is this? Why would you give Daniel everything?" For a moment, confusion clouded his face. Then his lips trembled into a soft smile I didn't recognize. "Sweetheart, Daniel needs it more," he murmured, his voice faint, as though speaking each word cost him energy he didn't have. He's starting a family." I promised him, long ago. I froze. A promise. That was his answer? After everything? Dad, my voice broke despite me fighting it. I've been paying for your care, your medications, everything, while he hasn't even visited. How is that fair? He turned away, his fragile shoulders trembling beneath the blanket. Don't make me choose between my children, he whispered. My throat tightened. I'm not making you choose, I said, forcing the words out evenly. You already did. I left before the tears won. In the hallway, I leaned against the wall, my chest heaving. A nurse passed by and gave me a sympathetic glance, like she'd seen this scene unfold before. And maybe she had. Later, as I sat in my car, I scrolled through my bank app. Payment after payment. Thousands. Every dent in my account was a reminder of love I thought was mutual. But maybe love wasn't enough. And somewhere deep down, a thought I hated crept in. What if Daniel didn't just need it more? What if he planned this? I wasn't ready to believe it, not yet. But I couldn't ignore the unease slithering beneath my ribs. And when I got home, drenched in silence, I noticed something in the envelope I'd missed before. A small handwritten note tucked between two documents. 4 words, written in Daniel's rushed, arrogant scrawl. Handle this quietly, Dad. My stomach dropped. Quietly? Number, not anymore. The note burned in my hand like a live coal. Handle this quietly, Dad. I read those words over and over, my pulse drumming in my ears. This wasn't just about an inheritance anymore. This was about control, about manipulation. And maybe betrayal I didn't want to see. I barely slept, my mind unraveling knots that only seemed to tighten. By morning, I decided I couldn't keep circling questions in my head. I needed answers, from him. When I arrived at the care home, my father was sitting by the window, pale morning light falling across his thinning hair. For a moment, he looked peaceful. Then he turned, and I saw the tension in his shoulders before he even spoke. Dad, I started softly, trying to steady my voice. I need you to be honest with me. He sighed, his gaze drifting to the floor. This is about the documents, isn't it? Yes, I said, clutching the folder in my hand. I found Daniel's note. I know he asked you to handle it quietly. What's going on? He hesitated, rubbing his temples like he was trying to massage memories back into place. It's complicated, sweetheart. You wouldn't understand. Then make me understand, I said, sharper than I intended. He flinched at my tone, and guilt washed through me instantly. But the ache in my chest wouldn't let me stop. I've been paying your bills, Dad. Every medication, every late-night emergency. And I'm not complaining. I wanted to. But then I find out everything's been signed away. To Daniel. Without a word. Finally, he met my eyes. And what I saw there terrified me more than anger ever could. Guilt. I made a promise, he whispered. Years ago, when your stepmother and I got married, Daniel's father had just walked out. Daniel blamed me for taking his place, for ruining his family. I told him someday I'd make it right. My chest tightened. Make it right by giving him everything? By pretending I don't exist? It's not like that. His voice cracked. Daniel's struggled for so long, I thought if I left him something, maybe he'd forgive me. I stared at him, the words ringing hollow between us. Forgive you? I repeated, my voice shaking. Dad, forgiveness isn't something you can buy. And what about me? What about the years I've spent taking care of you? Did you ever think about what that would do to me? His hands trembled as he reached for mine, but I couldn't move. Sweetheart, I thought you'd understand, he murmured. I pulled back slowly, my heart breaking in the silence that followed. I don't, I said finally. I don't understand any of this. I left his room before the tears could spill, walking blindly down the hall. As I passed the nurse's station, a soft voice called my name. Miss Taylor? It was Linda, one of the night nurses, her expression hesitant. Can I talk to you for a moment? I followed her into a small staff room, where she closed the door gently behind us. "I probably shouldn't be telling you this," she whispered, glancing toward the hallway. "But 2 weeks ago, when your stepbrother came with your stepmother and that notary, your father seemed confused. He kept asking what he was signing. My breath caught." "Are you sure?" She nodded slowly. "I heard him. And Daniel kept saying, 'It's just routine paperwork, Dad. Don't worry.'" Something inside me snapped. Not anger, not yet. Something colder. If what Linda was saying was true, my father didn't fully understand what he was signing. This wasn't just a broken promise anymore. It might be something worse. I walked out of the care home with one thought hammering in my head. I needed proof. And if Daniel thought I was going to handle this quietly, he was about to find out how wrong he was. The first thing I did when I got home was clear the kitchen table. I laid everything out: the envelope, the letters, the bank statements, every receipt I had from the past 6 months. The table looked less like a place to eat and more like a war room. My coffee went cold, untouched, as I traced timelines with shaking fingers, piecing together scraps of a story no one wanted me to know. There was one detail I couldn't get out of my head. Linda's words. "Your father seemed confused. Daniel kept saying it was just routine paperwork." I grabbed my phone and called the care home, asking for a list of visitors over the past month. When the receptionist hesitated, I told her it was for personal records. She emailed me a log within an hour. I scanned the list, and there it was. March 14th, Daniel Ellis, Margaret Ellis, and an independent notary. 3 names, 3 signatures, one decision that changed everything. I called Linda back. "Do you remember anything else about that day?" She hesitated before answering, her voice low and careful. "They came in around lunchtime. I remember because Margaret brought this really strong perfume. You could smell it down the hallway." I closed my eyes, imagining the scene. My stepmother's saccharine voice filling the room, Daniel leaning over my father's bed, pen sliding across paper like a blade under silk. "Did anyone else witness it?" I asked. "There was another nurse in the room," Linda said. "Angela. She left after a few minutes, though. Said Daniel told her they had it handled." "Of course he did." I hung up, my throat tight. Every new detail made it worse. My father had been surrounded. Daniel, Margaret, the notary. No one neutral in sight. And now, everything was theirs. I needed to talk to someone who understood more than I did. So I called my friend Rachel, a paralegal I'd gone to college with. She listened quietly as I spilled the whole story. When I finished, there was a long pause before she spoke. "Listen to me carefully," she said, her tone clipped and serious. "If your father didn't have the mental capacity to understand what he was signing, and if Daniel influenced him, that's called undue influence. You might be able to challenge it." My heart pounded harder. "But how do I prove it?" "Start gathering everything: medical records, receipts, witness statements, texts, voicemails, anything, and find out who that notary was. If they were working with Daniel, that could be huge." Her words were both a lifeline and a warning. I hung up, suddenly hyper-aware of the silence around me. I opened the envelope again and studied the forms carefully this time. The notary's name was printed at the bottom: Evelyn Hart. I wrote it down like it was evidence in a trial. That night, I drove back to the care home, determined to speak with Angela. She was on the evening shift, and when I found her at the nurse's station, she looked nervous just hearing my name. "I can't say much," she whispered, glancing around. "But your father didn't seem sure about what he was signing." Margaret kept reassuring him, saying it was all to simplify things. Daniel barely let him read the pages. My chest felt like it was caving in. As I walked down the hallway, past my father's door, I caught a faint trace of expensive perfume lingering in the air. Sweet, cloying, suffocating. Margaret's perfume. That scent had been in the room that day, wrapping itself around every signature like invisible ink. I paused, hand on the doorframe, staring at my father through the thin crack in the doorway. Was he protecting Daniel out of love or out of guilt? Either way, someone had rewritten my family's future, and it wasn't my father. And for the first time, I knew this wasn't just about betrayal. This was about manipulation. And manipulation could be proven. By the next morning, I'd made up my mind. If I was going to fight this, I needed to know exactly where things stood financially. So I drove straight to my father's bank, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles ached. The lobby smelled faintly of polished wood and expensive carpet cleaner, the kind of sterile comfort meant to make you forget how much money flows through these walls. I walked to the counter, clutching my folder of receipts and documents like armor. "Hi," I said carefully. "I need to check on my father's accounts. I'm an authorized user. I've been paying for his care, and I need to confirm the balances." The teller, a polite young woman with perfectly pinned hair, smiled at me, but then she started typing. Her expression changed almost instantly, softening into something I didn't like, something rehearsed. "I'm sorry, Miss Taylor," she said gently, "but your access has been removed." I blinked. "Removed? What do you mean? I'm on the account. I have the documents." She lowered her voice, leaning closer like she didn't want anyone else to hear. "Your father updated his beneficiary designations and access permissions about 2 weeks ago. Everything has been transferred under Mr. Daniel Ellis's authority." For a moment, I couldn't even form words. 2 weeks ago, the same week as the notary visit. I swallowed hard. "So you're telling me," I whispered, "that I've been paying bills from my account, while Daniel now controls his?" The teller hesitated, clearly uncomfortable, but nodded. "I can't give you more details without your father's consent." "I'm really sorry," I walked out without saying another word, my chest hollow, my breath ragged. Outside, the winter air stung my cheeks, but it barely registered. I sat in my car, staring at the steering wheel, trying to breathe through the anger clawing at my throat. Daniel hadn't just maneuvered himself into the will. He'd taken control of everything, quietly, deliberately, like someone sweeping footprints from sand. I called Rachel immediately. "Everything's under Daniel now," I said, my voice cracking despite myself. "Bank accounts, access, everything. And I've been paying thousands, Rachel. Thousands. He hasn't spent a dime." She swore softly under her breath. "This isn't just undue influence anymore. This could be financial exploitation. We need to act fast." I rubbed my forehead, pacing the length of my tiny living room once I got home. "What do I even do?" "Start documenting everything," she said firmly. "Every payment you've made, every conversation, every receipt. We'll need it if this goes to court." That night, I dumped my entire financial life onto the floor. Bank statements, care invoices, credit card bills, months of evidence scattered around me like broken glass. I highlighted every payment I'd covered, labeling each one with dates and amounts. $612 for medication, $327 for physical therapy, $4,980 over 3 months for private nursing care. I stared at the total until the numbers blurred. Then I thought of Daniel. Daniel, who hadn't visited once until 2 weeks ago. Daniel, who smiled for photos at holiday dinners, but never stayed past dessert. Daniel, who now had control over everything I'd been quietly, tirelessly holding together. I thought of my father, too, the man who used to check under my bed for monsters, who now had no idea he'd handed everything to one. I sat back, pressing my hands to my face, and whispered to the silence around me, "This isn't fair." But fairness wasn't going to fix this. As I was sorting through the receipts, something caught my eye. A tiny notation at the bottom of one of the bank statements. TOD beneficiary, Daniel Ellis. Transfer on death. Daniel wasn't just set to inherit. He'd already set up an automatic transfer for every remaining dollar. By the time I realized how deep this went, the anger in my chest had sharpened into something colder. Purpose. If Daniel wanted to erase me, he'd have to do more than hide behind paperwork and perfume, because I wasn't disappearing. Not quietly. I woke up the next morning surrounded by papers, receipts, invoices, statements, scattered across the floor like fallen leaves after a storm. The sunlight creeping through my blinds made the ink on them look sharper, darker, almost accusatory. I pulled myself up, poured stale coffee into a chipped mug, and sat cross-legged on the carpet. This was my battlefield now, and every receipt was a weapon. One by one, I organized them into neat piles. Medical expenses, prescriptions, therapy sessions, diagnostic scans, care home invoices, monthly bills, late-night emergency charges, personal transfers, every payment I'd made from my account to cover gaps no one else bothered to fill. I totaled it up again, hoping somehow the numbers had changed overnight. They hadn't. I'd spent nearly $18,000 in less than a year. $18,000. And yet, I had nothing to show for it. Not even a say in my father's care. Not even access to his accounts anymore. I snapped a photo of every document, uploading them into a new folder I named Case File. It wasn't just about money now. It was about proving a truth Daniel and Margaret thought they could bury. Halfway through scanning, I noticed something odd. An invoice dated 3 weeks ago, just before the notary visit. It wasn't from the care home or the pharmacy. It was from a consultation service I'd never heard of. A $2,000 charge billed to my father's account. I frowned, pulling up the company name online. No website, no listing. Just a P.O. box. That wasn't a consultation. That was cover. I wrote it down in red ink on my timeline, underlining it twice. The more I dug, the more inconsistencies I found. Small gaps, double-billed charges, miscellaneous fees on accounts Daniel now controlled. He wasn't just taking what was left. He was siphoning it before it even got there. My phone buzzed, breaking the silence. It was Rachel. "Tell me you're sitting down," she said, skipping hello entirely. "Define sitting," I muttered, surrounded by chaos on my living room floor. "I found Evelyn Hart, the notary," Rachel said. "Guess what?" She's worked with Margaret before. Twice. Both times on property transfers, I froze. "You're saying this wasn't random?" "I'm saying this was planned," Rachel replied grimly. "They brought in someone they already trusted." "That's not illegal on its own, but combined with your dad's condition? It's suspicious as hell." I grabbed a pen and circled Evelyn's name on the folder, pressing the ink so hard it nearly tore the paper. "Rachel," I whispered, "I think they coached him. I think they manipulated him into signing everything away." She exhaled slowly. "Then we need witnesses. Anyone who saw your dad confused. Anyone who heard Daniel pushing him. Linda and Angela from the care home are a start. Get their statements in writing before they get cold feet." I nodded, already scribbling their names on a legal pad. By evening, I had a growing stack of evidence. Receipts proving my financial contributions. Witness names ready for statements. Evelyn's history with Margaret. The suspicious consultation payment. But with every piece I gathered, one truth became clearer. This wasn't just a betrayal. This was a setup. I sat back, letting my head rest against the wall, staring at the mess around me. The weight of it pressed down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. That's when my phone buzzed again. This time a text. From Daniel. "Daniel, you need to stop digging, Claire. You'll only make things worse." My hands trembled as I read it again and again, each word colder than the last. He knew. He knew I was onto him. I took a deep breath and typed back one sentence, my fingers steady despite the storm inside me. "I'm just getting started." Because this wasn't about quiet anymore. This was war. After Daniel's text, sleep became a stranger. I spent the night wandering through memories I didn't ask to revisit. Memories of a house that stopped being mine the day my father remarried. I was 17 when Margaret moved in. Back then, the walls still smelled faintly of my mother's perfume, and the family photos lined the hallway like silent guardians. Within weeks, everything changed. Margaret brought her son, Daniel, and with him came quiet rearrangements. My mother's photos disappeared from the hallway, replaced by glossy portraits of Margaret's family vacations. My childhood drawings that had clung proudly to the fridge? Gone. In their place were Daniel's sports trophies, polished to a blinding shine. I remember coming home from school one afternoon, still wearing my uniform, and finding Daniel sprawled across the living room couch like he owned the place. His sneakers were on the coffee table my grandfather built. My coffee table. "You're on my side of the house," I'd said sharply, clutching my backpack. Daniel smirked without looking up from his phone. "Our house," he corrected, his voice dripping with entitlement. I stormed upstairs, my throat burning, and slammed the door. Later that night, I complained to my dad, expecting him to defend me, to remind Daniel that I'd been there first. Instead, he sighed. "Claire, you need to try harder with him." "He's adjusting. It's been hard for him too." Adjusting. That was the word everyone used whenever Daniel did something cruel. When he borrowed my laptop without asking, I had to adjust. When he spread rumors about me at school, I had to adjust. When he called me the charity case in front of Margaret's friends, I had to adjust. And every time, my father avoided taking sides. "We're a family now," he'd say, forcing a smile, while my stepmother looked on like a queen holding court. The day they redecorated my mother's room without telling me was the day something in me cracked. Margaret had painted over the pale lavender walls my mom chose, replacing them with sterile beige. I stood in the doorway, gripping the frame until my nails dug crescents into the wood. Daniel leaned against the opposite wall, watching me with a lazy grin. "Looks better this way," he said, like twisting a knife just to watch it hurt. I walked away without a word, but that moment stayed lodged inside me, sharp and festering. And now, all these years later, the ghosts of that house came flooding back. The signatures, the secrecy, the stolen trust, it all began there. That was the first time I understood what Daniel was capable of. He didn't just take space, he erased it. Back in the present, I sat on my bed with the old photo album spread open across my lap, flipping through pages of my childhood face, smiling alongside my parents. My father used to call me his little compass, saying I kept him grounded. But somewhere along the way, I stopped pointing north. Now, I had proof that Daniel had been planning this for weeks, maybe longer. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling this had been years in the making. This wasn't just about money. It was about control. And Daniel had always been winning. The phone buzzed again. A notification from Rachel. "Rachel, got Evelyn Hart's notary records." There's a signature discrepancy, I frowned, scrolling through the attached files she'd sent. My father's signature from 3 months ago, shaky but legible. The one on the transfer documents? Perfectly smooth. Too smooth. I leaned back, heart pounding. "This isn't his handwriting," I whispered into the quiet room. If Daniel had gone this far, then nothing was off limits anymore. And suddenly, the fight wasn't just about protecting what I'd paid for. It was about protecting the pieces of myself Daniel had been trying to erase since we were 17. The ghosts of that first house weren't just memories anymore. They were warnings. The next morning, I woke with one thought pounding in my head. I had to find Evelyn Hart, the notary, the silent witness who'd stood by while Daniel and Margaret orchestrated everything. If there was even the slightest chance she knew more than she put on paper, I needed to hear it directly from her. Rachel sent me her business address, a small office tucked between a nail salon and a tax prep center downtown. The sign out front was faded, the kind of place you'd miss if you weren't looking for it. Inside, the air smelled faintly of ink and dust, and the faint hum of an old ceiling fan filled the silence. I walked up to the front desk, where a woman in her mid-40s with chestnut curls glanced up from her laptop. Her nameplate read, Evelyn Hart. "Hi," I said carefully. "I'm Claire Taylor. I believe you notarized documents for my father, Richard Taylor, a couple of weeks ago." Her smile faltered for the briefest moment, so quick I almost doubted I saw it. "Yes," she said smoothly, folding her hands on the desk. "I remember, Mr. Taylor, very pleasant man. Was he?" I asked softly, leaning just slightly forward. Because I spoke to the nurses who were there that day, and they said he seemed confused. A flicker crossed her face, something between discomfort and calculation. She hesitated before responding. I can't disclose client details, she said finally, her voice tightening. I verified his identity. That's all I can say. I studied her closely. You've worked with Margaret Ellis before, haven't you? Her jaw tightened. Occasionally, yes. On property transfers? I pressed. Silence. Her fingers drummed lightly against the desk, betraying nerves she was trying to hide. Finally, she sighed, lowering her voice just slightly. Look, Ms. Taylor, I probably shouldn't say this, but your stepmother was persuasive. She insisted your father understood everything, and Daniel was the one who walked him through the forms. I did what I was hired to do, confirm signatures. That's it. I leaned back, coldness settling in my chest. Did you watch him read the documents? Her lips parted, but no sound came out. That silence was my answer. I left the office with my hands trembling, a knot tightening in my stomach. Evelyn might not have said the words out loud, but I heard them anyway. She hadn't verified a thing. When I got back to my car, Rachel called. How'd it go? She's protecting them, I said flatly. But she slipped. Margaret led the whole thing, and Daniel explained the forms. My father probably didn't read a single page, Rachel cursed under her breath. That could support undue influence, especially if we can prove Evelyn's past ties to Margaret. We can, I said, starting the engine, but I think we need more. That night, I went back to the care home to check in on my father. He was awake, propped against his pillows, watching a muted game show on TV. When I sat beside him, he smiled faintly, but his eyes looked tired. Dad, I said softly, taking his hand, do you remember signing papers with Daniel and Margaret a few weeks ago? He frowned, his forehead creasing as he searched for the memory. Papers? He murmured. Daniel said, just forms. Routine things. Do you remember what they were for? I asked gently. He shook his head. No. He said I didn't need to worry about it. My chest tightened. He didn't even know. I kissed his forehead before leaving, my resolve hardening with every step back to the car. I had Evelyn's hesitation. I had witness accounts. I had financial inconsistencies. But I didn't have enough yet. Not to win. And then, just as I pulled into my driveway, my phone buzzed with an unknown number. I answered cautiously. Hello? A woman's voice, low and shaky, whispered into the line. I saw what happened that day. You don't know me, but you need to hear this. I sat frozen in my car, knuckles white around the steering wheel. The woman on the other end of the line hesitated, her breath shaky. My name's Maria, she said finally. I'm a nursing assistant at the care home. I was in the hallway that day. When your stepbrother and stepmother came with the notary, my heartbeat pounded in my ears. Maria, what did you see? I shouldn't be talking to you, she whispered, her voice trembling. But your father looked lost, like he didn't understand what was happening. He kept asking questions, and Daniel kept saying, Don't worry, Dad, this is just routine. I swallowed hard. Did Evelyn, the notary, explain the documents? Maria paused, then let out a bitter laugh. She barely spoke. It was Daniel who did all the talking. Margaret stood behind him, nodding like a queen. And when your father hesitated before signing, Margaret, she put her hand on his shoulder and said, Trust us. It's for the best. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. It was one thing to suspect manipulation. It was another to hear it. Maria, I said softly, would you be willing to write that down? A statement? There was silence on the line, broken only by her unsteady breathing. I'll think about it, she whispered, then hung up. I sat in my car for a long time, staring into the darkness. Every new piece of the puzzle made the picture clearer and uglier. The next morning, I called Rachel. This isn't just speculation anymore, I told her. Daniel orchestrated the whole thing. Evelyn's connected to Margaret. The nurses confirmed Dad was confused, and now Maria says they pressured him to sign. Rachel didn't hesitate. It's time to bring in a lawyer. 2 hours later, I sat in a quiet office lined with dark shelves and framed certificates. Across the polished oak desk sat Michael Green, an elder law attorney Rachel recommended. He listened without interrupting as I poured everything out. The documents, the payments, Evelyn's ties, Maria's call. By the time I finished, my voice was raw. Michael leaned back, steepling his fingers. Claire, what you're describing fits the pattern of undue influence, pressuring a vulnerable person into making decisions they don't fully understand, usually for someone else's gain. I exhaled. Relief and dread tangled together. So we can fight this? Possibly, he said carefully. But we'll need evidence. Solid, documented proof. Medical records showing your father's mental state at the time, witness statements, financial records, and ideally, any discrepancies in signatures or timelines. I opened my folder and spread the documents across his desk like an offering. These, I said, pointing to the receipts, prove I've been paying for his care while Daniel hasn't contributed a cent. Good, Michael said, flipping through the papers. Keep these organized. They won't win the case alone, but they'll support your credibility, I hesitated, then slid Evelyn's name across the desk. And the notary? He studied it, eyebrows lifting slightly. If we can prove a prior relationship between her and Margaret, it strengthens your claim. I'll subpoena her records for the first time in weeks. I felt the faintest flicker of hope. Michael outlined the next steps. Request your father's medical records from the care home. Gather written statements from Linda, Angela, and Maria. Document every payment you've made. File an emergency petition to freeze major asset transfers until the case is resolved. Daniel's side will fight hard, Michael warned, his voice low and steady. And your stepmother, she won't hesitate to make this ugly. I nodded, bracing myself. Let them try. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the growing mountain of paperwork. For the first time, it didn't feel like chaos. It felt like armor. Then, just as I was labeling another folder, my phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. Unknown. You don't know who you're dealing with. Stop before you regret it. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. Daniel. It had to be. I put the phone down slowly, my voice steady as I whispered into the empty kitchen. Watch me. By the next morning, the storm had officially started. It began with a phone call from my stepmother. I stared at her name flashing on the screen, debating whether to answer, but something deep inside me said I needed to hear her voice. Claire, Margaret's tone was sharp, almost theatrical. I just heard you're trying to sabotage your father's wishes. How dare you? I gripped the phone tighter. I'm not sabotaging anything. I'm making sure Dad understood what he was signing. Her laugh was short and cold. You always were dramatic. Richard wanted Daniel to have control. He trusts him. Unlike you, my throat tightened, but I forced my voice to stay calm. Funny, I said, because the nurses remember him confused the day he signed. Maybe I'll let the court decide who Dad actually trusted. The silence on the other end was thick. Then she spat out, You're ungrateful. After everything we've done for you, I almost laughed. Everything you've done? Margaret, I've been paying for Dad's care for months, while Daniel hasn't contributed a cent. Don't lecture me about gratitude. She hung up without another word. I thought that would be the end of it for the day, but an hour later, my phone exploded with messages. From Daniel this time. Daniel, stop dragging everyone into this. Daniel, you're embarrassing yourself. Daniel, Dad made his choice. Accept it. I didn't reply. Not yet. Instead, I drove to the care home, hoping for a quiet visit with Dad. But when I walked into the lobby, I froze. Margaret was there, and so was Daniel. The air felt heavy, thick with unspoken war. Here she is, Margaret said, her voice dripping with false sweetness as she stood near the receptionist's desk. The devoted daughter. Daniel leaned against the counter, arms crossed, smirk firmly in place. You're wasting your time, Claire. Whatever fantasy Rachel's feeding you, it's not going to work. Dad wanted this. I clenched my fists at my sides, forcing myself to stay composed. If Dad wanted this, why not let him explain it himself? Daniel's smirk faltered for a second. He doesn't need to justify anything to you. I stepped closer, lowering my voice so only he could hear. Because he can't, can he? He doesn't even remember what he signed. For a moment, Daniel's jaw tightened, but then the smirk returned, wider this time. You really think you can win, Claire? Go ahead. Burn what little family you have left. I swallowed hard, refusing to look away. Daniel, I said softly, you burned it a long time ago. We stared at each other, the silence stretching until Margaret broke it with a sharp clap of her hands. This is ridiculous, she snapped. We're leaving. They stormed out together, leaving the lobby buzzing with quiet murmurs from staff and visitors who had witnessed every second. I sat with my father afterward, watching his fragile hands tremble as he tried to turn the pages of a crossword puzzle. He looked smaller than ever, his once steady presence fading into someone who barely recognized the war happening around him. I'm sorry, I whispered, taking his hand gently. He blinked slowly, confused. For what? For letting them do this to you, I said softly. But I promise, I won't let them take everything. That night, Rachel and I met at her apartment. Papers covered the coffee table, the couch, even the floor. We reviewed timelines, pieced together statements, and built a case brick by brick. You realize they're going to fight dirty, right? Rachel said, leaning back with a tired sigh. Margaret, especially. She'll spin this as you being the bitter daughter. Then let her, I said, my voice steady. I have the receipts. Literally, we both laughed weakly, exhaustion weighing us down, but the determination in my chest burned hotter than ever. Because this wasn't just about assets anymore. This was about dignity. It was about refusing to be erased by people who had been rewriting my place in this family since I was 17. By the time I got home, my phone buzzed again. Another message from Daniel. Daniel, you're going to regret this. I stared at the screen, then typed back a single sentence. See you in court. The next morning, I woke to a text from Rachel. Rachel, check your dad's garage if you can. Look for anything. Old files, letters, bank statements. We need leverage. I hated that word, but she was right. That afternoon, I drove to my father's old house. The driveway was cracked and uneven, leaves piling up in the corners. For a moment, I just sat in my car, staring at the garage door, feeling like I was about to walk into a memory I wasn't ready to face. Inside, the air smelled of dust and oil, stale like time had stopped here years ago. Cobwebs clung to the corners, and sunlight sliced through slats in the old blinds, painting thin stripes across forgotten boxes. I started pulling things down, stacks of yellowed bills, faded photographs, an ancient toolbox shoved behind a pile of paint cans. I dragged the box into the middle of the room and flipped it open, expecting to find wrenches and screws. But inside were letters. Dozens of them. Some in envelopes, some loose, all worn soft at the edges from being handled too many times. My chest tightened as I picked one up and unfolded it carefully. It was my father's handwriting, shaky, uneven. Daniel, I'm sorry for what happened with your father. I never meant to replace him. I promise I'll make it up to you someday. I stared at the words until they blurred, the weight of them crushing against my ribs. Letter after letter, I read apologies my father had written but never sent. Apologies for marrying Margaret. Apologies for breaking up Daniel's family. Apologies for being the reason Daniel grew up angry. Some of them went back 20 years. I sat on the cold concrete floor, the letters spread around me like pieces of my father I'd never known. For so long, I'd thought my father's choices came from love. But now, I saw they came from guilt. And guilt could be weaponized. I found one letter that froze my breath entirely. Margaret says the best way to fix things is to leave Daniel the house. She says Claire's young, she'll be fine. I hate choosing between them, but maybe this will finally make things right. The words blurred as tears stung my eyes. It wasn't just Daniel. Margaret had been whispering into his ear for years, planting seeds of fairness that bloomed into this mess. Suddenly, everything made sense. Why my father kept saying Daniel needed it more. Why he never defended me when Daniel crossed lines. Why he looked so small every time Margaret entered the room. My father had been carrying guilt like a leash, and Margaret and Daniel had been holding the other end. I gathered the letters carefully, stacking them into a neat pile. These weren't just memories anymore. They were evidence of years-long manipulation, proof that Daniel had been promised things before any decisions were made. Back in my car, I called Rachel. "Rachel," I whispered, "I found letters." Dozens of them. Dad promised Daniel everything years ago because Margaret convinced him to. "Claire," Rachel said, her voice tight. "That's huge. Those letters show a pattern. If we can prove Margaret influenced him long before his health declined, it strengthens your case tenfold." I nodded, clutching the box to my chest like it was oxygen. "Then we're using them." That night, I sat on my bed with the letters spread out around me, rereading them until my eyes burned. They weren't just apologies, they were confessions. My father had loved me. That much was clear in the little notes he'd scribbled in the margins. Claire's graduation today, proud of her. Claire's birthday, must call. But guilt had drowned his love, and Daniel knew it. Now I understood exactly how deep this went. This wasn't just financial exploitation. This was decades of quiet manipulation finally coming to light. And suddenly, I didn't just want justice. I wanted the truth carved into record, in ink no one could erase. I spent the next morning in silence. The letters spread across my kitchen table like fragile pieces of my father's soul. Coffee cooled untouched beside me as I reread the same pages over and over, tracing every uneven word with my fingertips. For years, I'd believed my father's decisions were complicated, messy, maybe even careless, but still his. Now, staring at his apologies scrawled in trembling ink, I understood something else entirely. His choices hadn't been free. They'd been purchased, not with money, but with guilt. One letter stood out from the rest. It was dated 15 years ago, when Margaret and Daniel had first moved in. My father had written, "Daniel lent me $10,000 when the business failed. I told him I'd make it up to him. Margaret says the cleanest way is to leave him the house someday. Claire's smart. She'll make her own way." My chest tightened as I read it again. That was it. That was the root of everything. This wasn't about love or fairness. It was about a debt my father thought he owed. A debt Margaret had nurtured like a gardener tending poisonous vines, letting them wind tighter around his neck with each passing year. I thought of the times my father had flinched when I argued with Daniel, the way he'd avoided confrontation, the way he always told me to let it go. He wasn't choosing Daniel because he loved him more. He was choosing Daniel because he thought he had to. I gathered the letters into a neat stack and drove to Rachel's apartment, my hands gripping the steering wheel like I was holding myself together. She opened the door in sweatpants, hair pulled into a messy bun, but when she saw the box under my arm, her eyes sharpened instantly. "You found something," she said, ushering me inside. I laid the letters across her coffee table, explaining everything I'd pieced together. The loan, the guilt, Margaret's influence. Rachel scanned each page, her expression darkening. "Claire," she said softly, "this changes everything." I frowned. "How?" She leaned back, tapping one of the letters. "Your father's mental state now is one thing, but these prove a pattern of manipulation stretching back over a decade. If we can show the court that Margaret and Daniel spent years planting this idea, that Daniel deserved everything, it strengthens your undue influence claim." I let out a shaky breath. But will the court even care about letters? They're just words. "They're more than words," Rachel said firmly. Their motive. They show your father didn't act independently, that he was pressured long before his health declined. Her conviction steadied me, but anger still roared beneath my ribs, hot and sharp. Because while I'd been draining my savings to pay for my father's care, Daniel had been playing the long game, and winning. That night, I sat by my father's bed, the soft hum of the care home machines filling the quiet. He was awake but tired, his eyelids heavy. "Dad," I whispered, taking his hand gently, "do you remember when Daniel lent you money for the business?" His brow furrowed faintly, a shadow of old shame crossing his face. "Yes," he murmured. "I promised him I'd make it right." "You already did," I said softly, fighting back tears. "You raised him. You gave him a home. You gave him everything. You don't owe him more." His hand trembled slightly in mine, and his voice cracked as he whispered, "I thought I was fixing things." I swallowed the lump in my throat and kissed his forehead. "You were never broken, Dad," I whispered. "You didn't need fixing." On my way out, I passed Margaret in the hallway. She was wearing that same suffocating perfume, sweet and heavy like rot beneath sugar. She smiled when she saw me, but her eyes were sharp. "You're digging too deep," she said softly, almost kindly, as though we were two friends sharing a secret. Back home, I opened a blank folder on my computer and named it The Record. Because now, I wasn't just building a case. I was building a story no one would be able to rewrite. Daniel thought he'd bought my father's silence, but he hadn't counted on me. The day of the emergency hearing arrived faster than I was ready for. I'd spent the past week buried in documents, scanning witness statements, organizing timelines, and breathing legal jargon until it became second nature. But no amount of preparation could settle the storm in my chest as I walked into the courthouse. The hallway smelled faintly of varnished wood and old paper, and the cold marble floor echoed under my heels. Rachel walked beside me, carrying a thick binder of evidence, her expression sharp and unshakable. Inside the hearing room, the air was heavy, too still, like everyone was holding their breath. My father sat at the end of the table, frail and small in his oversized sweater. He looked lost, like he didn't understand why he was here. On the opposite side sat Daniel and Margaret. Daniel was dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, leaning back in his chair like he owned the room already. Margaret sat next to him, lips painted deep red, posture flawless, her perfume faint even from across the table. When my father's name was called, the judge spoke gently, her tone measured. "Mr. Taylor, we're here to discuss your estate transfers and beneficiary changes. Do you understand why you're here today?" My father hesitated, glancing between us, his eyes clouded. I think so," he murmured. The judge's gaze softened, then shifted to Daniel. "Mr. Ellis, you initiated the changes, correct?" Daniel smiled politely, too polished, too rehearsed. "I simply helped my father fill out paperwork he'd been planning for years." Rachel stood, sliding our binder across the table. "Your Honor, we dispute that. We have multiple witness statements from care home staff confirming Mr. Taylor's confusion during the signing. We also have financial records showing systematic exclusion of Miss Claire Taylor, despite her covering over $18,000 in direct care expenses." Margaret leaned forward, her voice smooth as silk. "Your Honor, Claire is just upset she isn't getting more." Richard made his wishes clear. Rachel didn't flinch. "Then perhaps you can explain why the notary involved in these transfers, Evelyn Hart, has a documented history of working with Mrs. Ellis on previous property transactions. We've subpoenaed those records." For the first time, Daniel's confident smile slipped. The judge frowned, tapping her pen against the desk. "That is a significant detail. We'll review Evelyn Hart's involvement carefully." I looked at my father, sitting quietly between us all. For a split second, his eyes locked on mine, and something flickered there. Recognition, pain, maybe even apology. But then it was gone, replaced by confusion once more. Daniel shifted in his chair, breaking the silence. "Dad wanted this," he insisted, louder this time, As if volume could rewrite truth. Rachel stood her ground. With respect, Mr. Ellis, wanting something and understanding what you're signing are two very different things. The judge raised a hand to quiet the room. For now, the court will freeze all transfers and beneficiary changes until a full review is complete. No assets can move until we determine Mr. Taylor's capacity at the time of signing. Daniel's jaw tightened. Margaret's manicured nails dug into her armrest. I exhaled slowly, my hands trembling under the table. It wasn't victory, not yet. But for the first time, Daniel didn't look untouchable. After the hearing, I walked my father to the lobby. He gripped my hand lightly, his voice soft as he whispered, "Claire, am I in trouble?" I shook my head, swallowing hard. "No, Dad. You're not, I promise." But as Daniel brushed past us, his shoulder knocking against mine, he leaned close enough for only me to hear. "This isn't over." I didn't respond. I didn't need to, because for the first time, I wasn't afraid. The court had pressed pause. And now, I had time. Time to gather more evidence. Time to pull every thread until the entire plan unraveled. Margaret and Daniel thought they'd buried me. They didn't realize they'd just given me a shovel. 2 days after the hearing, Rachel called me at 7 a.m. sharp. Her voice was electric, the kind of energy that meant something big had surfaced. "Claire," she said without preamble, "we got the handwriting analysis back." I sat up in bed, clutching the phone. "And?" She paused just long enough to make my heart pound. "The signatures don't match." I blinked. "What?" "Your father's signature on the transfer documents. Perfectly smooth, consistent pen pressure, no tremor. But 3 weeks before that, on his medical consent forms, shaky, uneven, showing signs of motor decline." My mind spun. "Are you saying someone forged it?" Rachel hesitated. "I'm saying there's a significant discrepancy." Enough for the court to question authenticity. I slid out of bed, pacing the floor. Daniel wouldn't risk forging a signature. "That's too obvious, maybe he didn't," Rachel replied carefully. "But Evelyn, the notary, was there. If she turned a blind eye, she's complicit either way." I hung up, adrenaline surging. This was the opening we needed. Later that morning, I drove back to my father's care home, a folder of fresh evidence tucked under my arm. As I walked down the hallway, I passed Margaret coming the other way. Her heels clicked sharply against the tile, and her perfume, sweet, suffocating, hung in the air between us. She smiled without warmth. "Busy little bee?" she murmured. I stopped, meeting her gaze head-on. "You smell like guilt, Margaret." It's getting hard to ignore. Her smile faltered, but she didn't respond. She just walked past, her silence louder than any words. Inside my father's room, I sat by his bedside, holding his frail hand gently. "Dad," I whispered, "do you remember signing any documents with Daniel recently?" He frowned, blinking slowly. "Papers," he murmured. "Routine," Daniel said, "routine." "Do you remember reading them?" I asked softly. He hesitated, his lips trembling before he whispered, "No." I bit the inside of my cheek to keep from crying. On the way out, Linda, the nurse, pulled me aside. "I overheard something last night," she whispered. "Daniel was in the hallway, talking to Evelyn on the phone. He said, 'It's done. No one's questioning it.'" My stomach dropped. "Are you sure?" She nodded firmly. "I know what I heard." Back home, I called Rachel and relayed everything. She was silent for a moment, then said, "Claire, if we can prove Evelyn notarized a forged signature, or at least failed to verify authenticity, it blows their whole case apart." I stared at the evidence spread across my table. The shaky medical consent form, the flawless transfer signature, the letter Evelyn had signed to verify it was my father's, Linda's statement about Daniel's phone call. Every thread was converging on one truth. Daniel hadn't just manipulated my father, he'd cheated. Rachel filed a motion the next morning to compel Evelyn to testify under oath. The court scheduled an evidentiary hearing for the following week. When Daniel found out, He sent me a single text. "Daniel, you're making a mistake you'll regret." I stared at it for a long time before replying, "See you there." On the day of the hearing, Evelyn sat in the witness chair, hands folded too tightly in her lap. Rachel questioned her calmly, but relentlessly, walking her through the inconsistencies. "Miss Hart," Rachel said, holding up two documents. "Do you see the difference between these signatures?" Evelyn hesitated, then nodded. "Yes." "Did you witness Mr. Taylor sign these forms?" Her eyes darted toward Daniel, then back to Rachel. "I verified identity," she said softly. "That wasn't my question," Rachel pressed. "Did you see him sign?" A long, fragile pause. "No," Evelyn whispered finally. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Daniel shifted in his seat, his jaw clenched, but Margaret's hand on his arm kept him silent. I exhaled for the first time in what felt like months, my pulse thundering in my ears. The judge called for a recess, her expression unreadable, but I didn't need her words to know what had just happened. For the first time, Daniel's perfect foundation had cracked, and this time I wasn't the one holding the shovel. The final hearing came 2 weeks later. By then, everything had changed. Evelyn's testimony had set off a chain reaction. Bank statements were subpoenaed, Daniel's financial trail picked apart, and Margaret's carefully polished facade began to crumble under the weight of questions she couldn't answer. I sat in the courtroom, my palms resting on the cool wood of the table, heart pounding as the judge reviewed our evidence one last time. The air felt heavy, tense, like everyone was holding their breath. After reviewing the medical records, witness statements, financial documents, and the notary's testimony, the judge began, her voice measured and calm. The court finds that Mr. Richard Taylor lacked full capacity at the time the transfer documents were executed. I closed my eyes, a slow, trembling exhale escaping my chest. The judge continued, "The transfers are hereby reversed. Mr. Daniel Ellis will have no further authority over Mr. Taylor's accounts, and control will remain jointly between Mr. Taylor and Ms. Claire Taylor. Any future changes will require court supervision." Daniel didn't move. He sat frozen, jaw clenched, eyes locked on the floor, like if he didn't look up, this reality wouldn't exist. Margaret, though, couldn't hide her fury. Her knuckles whitened as she gripped her handbag, lips pressed so tightly they drained of color. For me, though, it wasn't triumph I felt. Not exactly. It was relief tangled with grief. Because while I'd won, it didn't feel like victory. Not when I looked at my father. After the hearing, I sat beside him in the quiet hallway, holding his frail hand as people shuffled past us. He stared at the polished floor, his voice soft and unsteady. "I'm sorry, sweetheart," he whispered. "I never wanted it to come to this." I shook my head, squeezing his hand gently. "You don't need to be sorry, Dad." "None of this was your fault." He looked at me then, really looked at me, like some part of him understood the weight of everything, even if just for that moment. "Thank you," he said simply, tears brimming in his tired eyes. I smiled faintly, brushing them away with my thumb. Always. Later, as I walked out of the courthouse, Daniel was standing by the steps, leaning against the railing with his hands shoved deep into his pockets. His eyes met mine for the briefest second before he looked away, jaw tightening. I thought about stopping, about saying something sharp, final, maybe even cruel, but I didn't, because this wasn't about him anymore. It wasn't even about the money, or the house, or the accounts. It was about reclaiming my father's dignity, and mine. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, the same place this nightmare began, surrounded by the box of letters I'd found in the garage. I read them one last time, carefully folding each apology, each confession, each proof of my father's quiet love tangled with guilt. Then I packed them away, not as evidence, not as weapons, but as pieces of a man who had tried, in his flawed and human way, to keep his family together. I still don't know if I'll ever forgive Daniel. Maybe I won't. But I've let go of the need to fight him anymore, because some battles aren't worth carrying forever. What I keep is my father's trust, restored in whatever time we have left. What I let go is the weight of being erased. Before I close this chapter, I want to say something to you, listening right now. If you've stayed with me until the end, maybe your heart has felt something too. Maybe you've been here, in some way, carrying your own version of this story. If you have, you're not alone. So if you want to stay, if you want to keep walking through these stories with me, hit like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. I read every one of them, and thank you for listening, for staying, for caring.